The snow-covered fields of eastern France were quiet on the morning of December 19th, 1944, in a small barracks near the village of Lorraine. Private Bruce Finchel was seated on his bunk, writing a letter home. His hands were cold, and the ink smudged slightly on the page. For the first time in nearly 3 months, his unit, D Company of the 8th Tank Battalion, had been pulled off the front line. The men were exhausted, dirty, and emotionally drained after more than 80 days of continuous combat. But they were alive, and for now that was enough. Finchel paused his writing and stared out the frosted window. Snow drifted across the muddy roads outside. It felt like peace, or at least something close to it. Then the door slammed open. Their first sergeant stormed into the room, boots pounding on the wooden floor. "Pack your duffel bags and get ready to roll," he growled. "One of you go to the kitchen, take whatever food you can carry. We leave in 2 hours. The entire room groaned. They had barely started to relax. Now they were being sent back into the fight. But this time it would be different. Something had gone wrong, badly wrong. The sergeant gathered the men and explained. The Germans had launched a massive surprise attack in the Ardennes forest. American lines had been overrun. Towns were falling. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded in a place called Bastogne. And now Patton's Third Army, including the 4th Armored Division, was being ordered to punch through. Their mission: relieve Bastogne. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes had begun just 3 days earlier. On December 16, 1944, it was Hitler's last gamble. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, had attacked through a forested region the Allies believed was too difficult for major operations. The gamble had worked. The American front had buckled. Supply lines were cut, and the roads were jammed with retreating units. But it wasn't just a surprise attack. It was a strategic attempt to change the course of the war. Hitler hoped to drive all the way to Antwerp, splitting the British and American forces and forcing the Allies into a negotiated peace. He believed the Western alliance was fragile. If he could break it, maybe, just maybe, Germany could survive. But there was one thing standing in his way. George S. Patton. Patton was a controversial figure, bold, ruthless, brilliant. His army was already preparing for an offensive into Germany when news of the Ardennes reached headquarters. In one of the boldest strategic maneuvers of the war, Patton proposed a sudden, massive pivot of his entire Third Army, hundreds of thousands of men, to swing north and strike into the German flank. It was a logistical nightmare. Roads were frozen, supplies were limited, and the enemy was already entrenched. But Patton didn't hesitate. His orders were simple: get to Bastogne, break the siege, save the 101st. Among the many units involved was the 4th Armored Division, Patton's spearhead. Known for their speed and aggression, the division had proven itself in battles across France. Now it would lead the charge into Belgium. Within the 4th Armored was Combat Command BCCB, a combined arms formation of tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, and engineers. At its core was the 8th Tank Battalion, commanded by the tough and relentless Major Albin Erzik. These men, including Finchel and his M5 Stuart light tank crew, were about to become part of one of the most dramatic and heroic advances of the entire war. As the tanks rolled out of Lorraine, the weather turned. Snow fell heavily. Roads iced over. The convoy crept forward through the night, headlights dimmed, engines rumbling. Visibility dropped to just a few meters at times. Still they moved. Inside the tanks the men were silent. Some smoked. Others stared at family photos taped near their instruments. They knew what was waiting in Bastogne, and they knew they had to reach it before it was too late at night. Fenchel sometimes couldn't even see the tank ahead of him. More than once he rear-ended the vehicle in front. But the order from Erzik was clear. Keep moving. No excuses. By December 22nd, the lead elements of CCB reached the village of Chaumont. Snow clung to the trees, and the early morning light was dim and gray. It looked peaceful. Too peaceful. That's when the tree line exploded. The road from Lorraine to Bastogne was more than just a distance. It was a test of endurance, courage, and leadership. For the men of the 4th Armored Division, the days that followed December 19th would feel like years. As they pushed north, the snow thickened. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Vehicles slipped and skidded off icy roads. Mechanics worked with frozen hands to keep tanks moving. Sleep was brief. Meals were cold. And the threat of enemy fire was constant. Major Alban Erzik, commanding the 8th Tank Battalion, led from the front. He drove alongside his tanks, often standing in his hatch, scanning the tree line with binoculars. He knew this would be no ordinary fight. The enemy they faced, the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, was a mix of elite paratroopers and poorly trained conscripts. But they held the terrain, the weather was on their side, and they were desperate. On December 22nd, Bruce Fenchel was in the driver's seat of his M5 Stuart as it rumbled toward Chaumont. Snow and ice caked the windshield. He could barely see more than a few meters ahead. The sun hadn't risen yet. It was cold, the kind of cold that burns your lungs and numbs your fingers. But Fenchel stayed focused. His tank led the way. Suddenly, gunfire shattered the morning silence. Machine guns rattled from the woods. German troops ambushed the column. Mortar exploded across the field. 2 jeeps burst into flames. Fenchel instinctively turned his tank to provide cover. Then the unthinkable happened. A shell struck a nearby tank. Flames shot skyward. Fenchel opened his hatch to check on his crew, but bullets struck the side of his tank. As he dove back inside, blood splashed onto him. His commander had been shot in the face. Another crew member never even made it into the vehicle. Fenchel tried to maneuver, but another shell hit his tank, tossing him like a ragdoll. He crawled away through the snow, ears ringing, uniform soaked in blood and oil. He found cover behind a ditch and waited. When a fuel truck passed by, he flagged it down and clung to the side as they retreated under fire. Later that day, he found shelter in a Belgian home. The family hid him in their attic. That night, German troops entered the house below. Fenchel listened as they sang Christmas carols. He didn't move a muscle. Hours passed in silence. Back on the battlefield, the Americans responded fast. Artillery pounded the German positions. Combat engineers raced to repair the blown bridges the Germans had destroyed. Major Erzik ordered his tank platoons to hammer the tree lines with machine gun and cannon fire. Forward observers called in 105mm shells on enemy hills. Mortar launched into the snowy woods. One soldier, Sergeant Roscoe Albertson, saw a German machine gun nest, and calmly adjusted his mortar under direct fire. One round, then another. On the third shot he scored a direct hit. 16 Germans surrendered on the spot. Albertson earned a Silver Star for his bravery. As Fenchel hid in the attic, he could hear the shelling from miles away. In Martlange, the Americans met similar resistance. Guise advanced through narrow streets as Panzerfaust rockets screamed past them. One American officer, Major Alanis, realized that the frontal assault wasn't working. He ordered a platoon of tanks to flank the village under cover of darkness. As they reached the town church, Sherman tanks opened up, machine guns chattering, 75mm shells pounding German defensive positions. Flames lit up the town as German defenders broke and ran, but even with Martlange mostly secure, the road to Bastogne remained blocked. That's when Patton himself stepped in. He ordered a bold move. Send a single armored column straight through the German lines, fast, hard, and without hesitation. Leading that charge would be a unique Sherman tank known as Cobra King. Asterisk, as December 23rd dawned, the men of the 4th Armored Division were scattered across a frozen battlefield, stretching from Martlange to Chaumont. Snow blew sideways, stinging faces and freezing rifles. Visibility was nearly zero. The rumble of tank engines echoed through valleys like distant thunder. Major Erzig's 8th Tank Battalion had suffered heavily. 11 tanks destroyed, dozens of men lost or missing. Yet morale remained unbroken. Patton's order was clear, keep pushing north. Bastogne had to be reached, whatever the cost. In Chaumont, the fighting had turned house to house. German paratroopers and assault gun crews defended every barn and stone wall. American artillery fired so close to friendly lines that shells burst only yards ahead of advancing GIs. Lieutenant John McNiff and Sergeant Celestino Lucero crawled through the snow, lobbing grenades into machine gun nests one by one. Private William South flanked another position, firing his bar until 4 Germans dropped their weapons and surrendered. The snow around them was scorched black by explosions. Inside the village, Fenchel was still hidden in an attic. Below him he could hear German boots on the wooden floor, muffled voices, the clink of bottles, then singing. Still not? Heilig Nacht. For hours he lay motionless, listening to the enemy celebrate Christmas Eve. When morning came, the Germans were gone. The Belgian family brought him bread, cheese, and hot milk. They sat together quietly, pretending for a moment that the war was far away. That illusion ended when the American barrage returned. 36 howitzers thundered in unison, shaking the walls. Shells ripped through the rooftops of Chaumont. Fenchel watched through a crack in the attic wall as American tanks emerged from the smoke Shermans, their barrels glowing red-hot. The family smiled through tears. Liberation had come. Fenchel ran outside as the first tank rolled past. Its driver turned out to be the gunner from Fenchel's old crew, the same man who had escaped their burning Stuart. "I want to go home," Bruce shouted. The gunner grinned. "You're going back in the turret. Get in the driver's seat." And just like that, Fenchel was back in the fight. While CCB fought through Chaumont, Combat Command A battled its way through Warnock and Bougainville. Roads were clogged with wrecks and dead livestock frozen in place. Engineers patched bridges under fire. Medics dragged the wounded into ditches to bandage them before frostbite set in. Every mile north felt like a Victory. Captain Jimmy Leach's. B Company of the 37th Tank Battalion advanced cautiously toward Flatzberhof. Snipers cracked from the tree line. Bullets sliced through commanders' hatches. Sergeant John Fitzpatrick took a round through both cheeks, but stuffed a bandage in his mouth and kept commanding. Sergeant John Parks wasn't as lucky, shot through the head while leading his platoon. His gunner, Herman Coffey, took over and kept firing until a German shell turned their Sherman into a fireball. 2 men crawled out alive. By nightfall, exhaustion blurred reality. Men spoke little. They just loaded, aimed, fired, and moved. The 4th Armored was grinding its way through what Patton later called the worst terrain for tanks in the whole damn war. On Christmas Eve, the snow finally eased. For the first time in days, fighter bombers could fly. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, dropping bombs and rockets on German lines. One pilot radioed, "Merry Christmas, boys, this one's for you." That night, inside a field headquarters lit by a single lantern, Colonel Creighton Abrams gathered his officers. "Tomorrow," he said, "we reach Bastogne." The men were silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The 101st Airborne had been cut off for a week, surrounded, freezing, and low on ammunition. If the 4th Armored didn't break through soon, Bastogne would fall at dawn on December 26th. The order came. CCR Combat Command Reserve would lead the final push. At its spearhead was C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion. 9 Shermans. The lead tank, a special up-armored jumbo, nicknamed Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bogus. As the column formed up, the crews checked their weapons one last time. The men painted white stars on their turret targets for enemy gunners, but symbols of hope for anyone watching from Bastogne. Snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. At 8 a.m., Cobra King lurched forward. Artillery pounded German positions on both sides of the road. The Shermans fired as they advanced coaxial machine guns, spraying the woods, 75mm rounds, blasting at pillboxes. Infantry rode on the tanks, jumping off to clear buildings and trenches. In the village of Assenois, German resistance stiffened. Anti-tank guns knocked out 2 Shermans. Several Gs were hit by short-falling Allied shells. Still the column pushed on. Bogus's gunner, Corporal John Yaremchuk, fired round after round. They smashed a concrete bunker, then another. German troops broke and ran. Bogus saw them silhouetted against the snow, some still holding mess tins from their morning rations. "They fell like dominoes," he wrote later. By early afternoon, the tanks neared Bastogne. The radio crackled with static. Ahead, a line of foxholes cut across the field machine guns, pointing directly at Cobra King. Bogus hesitated. Were they Germans using captured gear, or Americans holding the perimeter? He stood up in his hatch and shouted, "Come on out, this is the 4th Armored." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then a man climbed out of a foxhole, snow up to his knees. "I'm Lieutenant Webster, 326th Engineers, 101st Airborne," he said. "Glad to see you." Bogus reached down, shook his hand, and smiled. The siege of Bastogne was over. The road behind Cobra King was littered with burning tanks, shattered trees, and silent bodies. But the corridor to Bastogne was open. Supply trucks and ambulances streamed through within hours. Airborne medics wept as fuel and food arrived. For the first time in days, The defenders of Bastogne could breathe. Patton received the news in his headquarters near Luxembourg. A staff officer burst in. "Bastogne has been reached, sir." Patton smiled, lifted his riding crop, and said quietly, "Well, that's that." Then he went back to planning the next move. For the men who fought their way there, the victory came at a terrible cost. The 4th Armored Division lost more than 1,000 men killed or wounded in the relief operation. The snow concealed most of them until spring. Finchel survived, barely. Weeks later he wrote to his family again, the same letter he had begun before the order to move out. He never mentioned the blood, the cold, or the smell of burning tanks. He simply wrote, "We made it. I'm okay." Major Erzig continued to command through the rest of the war. Later writing, "We were tired beyond words, but proud beyond measure." Colonel Abrams went on to become one of the U.S. Army's most respected leaders. The modern M1 Abrams tank carries his name. Lieutenant Bogus returned home and lived quietly, though every Christmas he remembered that day on the road to Bastogne. "My few minutes of glory," he said, "lasted 4 miles and 25 minutes. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month before the German army finally collapsed. Over 80,000 American casualties, 100,000 German. It was the last great offensive of the Third Reich and its death throes. Today, if you stand on the highway south of Bastogne, you can still trace the route of the 4th Armored Division. The fields are quiet again. A memorial marks the spot where Cobra King broke through, its turret now pointing toward freedom. The snow still falls each winter, covering the scars of battle. Beneath it lie stories of fear, courage, and brotherhood of men like Bruce Finchel, who went from writing a letter in a barracks to driving straight into history. And when the wind moves across those empty fields, it carries faint echoes of engines, gunfire, and the distant words once shouted through the smoke. This is the 4th Armored. Thanks for watching this episode. If you found this story powerful or learned something new, consider subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us keep history alive, one story at a time.